All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the session today on Data by Public Interest Tech, making the case for diversity and inclusion. Also, thank you so much for all of the folks that shared what they were interested in learning about during this session. Hopefully, I can answer everything throughout the presentation, but we'll also have some time at the end to open it up for questions and discussion. So quick note on using Gather. As you may have noticed, the platform uses proximity chat. So it's like like real life in the sense that the further you get away from someone, the quieter they get. So here, the chat box you can see is on the left-hand side. You can message folks nearby, everyone in the space, or to a specific user. Most of the controls are on the bottom of your screen. And feel free to liberally use the emoji reactions. There's also a hand raise one if you need any help or have any questions. We have a couple folks from my team that are moderating. And on the bottom right-hand side are your controls to mute, unmute, and show and hide your video. Don't, do whatever makes you feel comfortable. You don't have to show your video if you don't want to. So yeah, I'd love for folks to use the chat to introduce yourselves with your name, location, and a bit about yourself. And throughout the presentation, feel free to comment, heckle, ask questions, or whatever you'd like in the chat. And so a bit about me. So my name is Jen, and I'm currently a fellow leading the Public Interest Technology Workforce Project at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. We're located at Georgetown University. I'm also currently getting my master's at the Parsons School of Design in Strategic Design and Management. And my background is in human-centered design. Most recently, I worked for the federal government at the U.S. Digital Service. And as a design leader, I have been on a mission to make workplaces more inclusive and foster workplace cultures that allow people to bring their full authentic selves to work. Because let's be real, we spend 40 hours a week or more at work, and that's a lot of freaking time. Too often, people of color, anyone who knows what it feels like to be othered, women, we're all pressured to conform to a workplace standard, to a norm that's perpetuated by a dominant culture and narrative. And I've literally been trying to learn this for the past 10 years of my career. You know, that feeling when you realize you kind of have to mold yourself to fit in, or you compartmentalize your work self and your home self. And one day you realize that you've just been chipping away at your identity. Unlearning this has been incredibly hard. I'm constantly second-guessing myself, feeling super self-conscious. Shout out, kudos to my friends, family, and colleagues for putting up with me. This whole journey has made me realize how important it is to create inclusive spaces now and for future generations. And I'm hopeful, but I'm not trying to be too optimistic, that maybe now is the time. With COVID and this pandemic, the boundaries of life and work have blurred for a lot of people. We're getting glimpses into people's lives. You know, if you are seeing my video right now, you can see that I'm basically sitting in this weird side closet alcove thing underneath a staircase. So welcome to my living space. And there's this opportunity to recognize that when we're our whole selves, we can be more productive and effective, which is kind of just all capitalistic BS, really. But really, any of the reasons that this matters to me is that we can be better colleagues, coworkers, friends, and ultimately better humans that care about one another. Because for far too long, our society has consistently discriminated against and oppressed certain groups of people. Trust me, I have been in some pretty toxic work environments. Like in one instance where a personal thing I shared ended up hurting me professionally. But I've also been fortunate to be on some great teams as well. So all of this is to say that while this isn't ideal and we aren't there yet, we can create the future that we want to see. So let's dig in and talk about public interest tech and diversity and inclusion and figure out where we need to go. So I'm not going to talk about why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for teams. Let's just baseline acknowledge that yes, they are important. And I think if you're here, then you know the benefits. And you can read all of the things that you want about it in the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, or Fast Company articles all about it. I do think that it is worth it to define what we're talking about here, especially since a handful of folks are new to the public interest tech space. But welcome, we're glad you're here, and we hope you get hooked on the mission and obsess with how to get into the field as well. Yeah, so what is public interest tech? So you may have heard the terms civic tech or gov tech, and yes, public interest tech, or PIT, as some folks love to annoyingly call it. I'm just kidding, I call it PIT too, but probably annoyingly. So anyway, PIT is the larger umbrella term. We know the public sector is about delivering better outcomes to the public, like improving how individuals receive their benefits or access services they need. So in pandemic times, this means getting unemployment and access to COVID vaccines. And public interest tech specifically uses design, data, and technology to help get to those outcomes. Oh, and we can basically only go up from here. A Gallup poll conducted in January found that only 27% of Americans are satisfied with the US government. As more and more people rely on government services, especially right now during the pandemic, we're forced to interact with government systems that are outdated and difficult to use. So how does this make the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, let's take a step back first, and let me share how I define these three terms. Diversity refers to diversity of identities. So gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, all of that good stuff. Inclusion is about creating an environment where each individual feels welcomed and valued. And equity, that means that we recognize that advantages and barriers exist, and that we don't all start from the same place. It's a commitment to correct and address these imbalances so everyone has access to the same opportunities in a way that makes sense for them individually. And this quote is such a good metaphor, I had to share it. So think of diversity as being asked to the party and inclusion being asked to dance. So is there anyone that wants to dance? All of this being said, this recently shows why our government needs to reflect the people we serve. Often, anyone on the fringes is an afterthought, and that is not okay because those people are the people who usually need our help the most. If organizations that we work within aren't diverse, inclusive, or working through an equity-centered lens, then how can we really serve our communities? All right, so now that I've set the stage and background, how do we use data to drive the changes I'm talking about? Last November, the Beck Center put out a US public interest tech workforce survey. Our hope was to capture the demographics, experiences, backgrounds, and equity and inclusion sentiments of the people working in this field. Especially because this field is growing, we recognize we have the opportunity right now for organizations, leaders, and individuals in this space to do better. We also recognize the power of data, that we'd be able to glean insights and takeaways and help shape what we work on. So we had over 200 people respond to our survey, but in the end, we only had 196 valid responses. We had a handful of folks from outside of the US respond, but we were just focused on the US experience for the survey. So we got a little over half of the states represented in our findings, with respondents hailing from 29 states and DC. And respondents came from 90 plus different organizations. 72% of folks had experience working within government, which is then broken down into federal, city, state, and county. And then that's followed by folks working within nonprofits, for-profits, and then academia. And a majority of the folks indicated that they're currently working for public interest tech right now, followed by volunteering, and then folks who had worked for a PIT org in the past. 35% of respondents work at the individual contributor level, followed by 26% working as a manager or supervisor, and 23% at the executive or C-suite level. And so this matches our findings for years of experience in the public interest tech field as well. We tallied it up, and 69% of our respondents had 3 or more years working in the PIT field. So our survey results are definitely more skewed towards mid-level and senior professionals. And we also asked respondents how they identified as a public interest technologist. So 96% of folks said that they design and or build tools meant to implement policy or improve government service delivery, followed by advocating for the inclusion of public voice and engagement within government, and working in government in a technical role, rounding out those top 3. As for demographics, 70% of our survey respondents were white, followed by Asian, which is actually pretty high for tech. On the other hand, our gender split far exceeded the norm for tech, where typically only 25% of roles are held by women. So in our survey, we had 48% men, 45% women respond, with the other 8% of respondents indicating they were genderqueer, agender, non-binary, or not specifying. Before I dive into the survey findings, I do want to call out that surveys are always going to be subject to biases and limitations. And this is just given the fact that the responses are self-reported. So, the findings and stuff, these responses are not going to be representative of the entire public interest tech population. So that being said, our most important finding is to never use Typeform for surveys. All joking aside, the main takeaway here is to pick your survey tool of choice wisely. It was easy enough for our team to set up, but the user experience for respondents was horrendous. People had a hard time skipping questions or figuring out when something was single choice or multiple choice. And for that, we are forever sorry. But okay. In all seriousness, we did uncover a few findings based on the data we collected. The first one, the majority or 50% of our respondents found out about the field through friends and word of mouth. While this is very much on par with the private industry, and there are a lot of known benefits to referral hires, like that they tend to have a more realistic idea of what the job entails, they hit the ground running quicker, and they tend to stay at organizations longer, the one major drawback is from a diversity perspective. People are often likely to refer people who have the same gender and ethnic background, which can unfortunately create a monoculture in the workplace. We also found that 81% of respondents have 3 or more years of work experience prior to their public interest tech role, which can mean a few things for early career technologists, like students and recent grads. So it can mean that the field doesn't have the resources to bring on entry-level employees, that there aren't many junior-level roles available to them, and that students and recent grads just may not be aware of the technical positions available to them in this space. And our last finding is around recruitment, recognition, and responsibilities as it relates to the equity and inclusion statements we posed. So we had a total of 10 statements, and overall, respondents rated their organizations well across all categories. But we did have 3 statements that had 15% or more disagreement, so just wanted to call these 3 out here. The first one, with 19% of respondents disagreeing with the statement that people are equitably recruited into the organization that they volunteer with or work for. We had 17% disagree with believing that their organization accurately recognizes and compensates their work accomplishments. And finally, 15% disagreed with the statement that administrative tasks don't have a specific owner, are divided fairly at their organization. So what do these findings mean? And how do we fix this? And how do we use this to make the case for diversity and inclusion? So anyone working in this space knows that the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a systemic problem. So the real question is, how do we change the system? As with all systemic issues, organizational decision makers and leaders need to take action. And that is very much our audience for these survey findings. Programs like employee resource and affinity groups are absolutely great. Solidarity, allyship, and support is so important in the work that we do, and we should definitely continue to foster these groups. But I also particularly hate that the onus and burden is put onto employees when the larger organization needs to change. So executive and management DEI trainings are not enough. Leaders need to just stop paying lip service and commit to taking this seriously. So I'm going to call out 5 recommendations that they can do specifically. And we wanted to make these broad enough so they could be applied to almost any industry, not just Pitt. So the first one, conduct your own diversity and inclusion surveys and also make them public. So the benefit of this is that it helps you get a baseline understanding of where your organization is at, and you can be held accountable for changes year to year if you publicize them. Also, get a sense of how many hires have been from referrals to ensure that your referral program has not adversely impacted your diversity initiatives. So referrals should also be assessed in a manner that is consistent with how you currently assess candidates who apply or find out about your organization via other channels. Distribute work in an equitable manner. So ensure that office housework responsibilities are equally assigned to all individuals in your organization, and consider all eligible employees for new glamorous work assignments, not just the individuals who come to mind first or who have asked in the past. Conduct a pay equity audit to identify any potential disparities. Pay equity is one way to ensure fair compensation and recognition. And hiring entry-level employees is not going to start overnight, especially if it's not something that you're currently doing. So start by analyzing your existing hiring needs, taking a look at what your onboarding program looks like, and seeing what projects you have to find opportunities where entry-level roles make sense. As an individual contributor, someone who's just starting out, or a student, how can you use data to make the case for diversity and inclusion? Well, data is fine and all, but I'm sure when I was rattling off all of the statistics we found in the survey, everyone's eyes probably glazed over. What we remember are the stories. So while I'm sure you're not going to remember that 81% of something, you will remember, well, hopefully you will remember my story I shared at the beginning, or, how referrals tend to create monocultures. My point here is that data should be used to find trends and insights, but we need to use storytelling to communicate this. It's hard to convince someone by showing them the data. Otherwise, we'd all be flossing regularly and eating super healthy meals because the data shows the benefits. And I want to tell you that you don't have to do anything because we've all carried the burden long enough. But unfortunately, we don't live in that reality yet. So what can you do in the meantime? Use employee resource groups as an opportunity to share stories, experiences, and solutions with your leadership. Whether they're about the times your members experience microaggressions on their teams, or when project opportunities weren't equally distributed. Foster an inclusive environment on your own smaller team. So for me, whenever I catch myself thinking, oh, I wish things were like this here, I turn that inward and I try to do that with my smaller team first. And eventually they become norms on our smaller team. And this has often led to other teams then adopting them as practices themselves. Push your organization to publicly share their diversity and inclusion statistics. That's all I'm going to say on that one. And to address the referral bias I mentioned before, strive to refer a diverse group of people into your organization instead. So before we wrap, I also wanted to share some of our lessons learned from the survey process, what we wish we did differently, and our vision for what's next. Remember, don't use Typeform. Don't forget it. But really, we could have done a better job of recruiting survey respondents. We leveraged our networks, and a lot of results ended up being skewed because of it. So, we had a lot of respondents that worked in government, for example. And to be honest, that's a lot of the folks in our networks. So for the next time, we'll definitely actively do a better job of recruiting for the survey. We also got a lot of feedback that respondents felt survey fatigue. Not gonna lie, our survey was pretty long. It had 44 questions. And in hindsight, we really should have considered, incentivizing respondents or shortening the survey. And I'm sharing these two things just in case folks want to do their own surveys within their own teams or organizations. As always, hindsight is 2020. As for next steps, please dig into our data. We have the anonymized raw data available for folks to build upon our work and find insights that we may have missed. It'd be great to see future surveys capturing data around retention, career advancement, or remote work in this field. And my vision for the future of this field is that we have a workforce that looks like and can represent the people that we serve. And that public interest tech does DEI so well that we could one day become a model for other industries to leverage. But for now, I don't want public interest tech to look like or turn into Silicon Valley tech. I know I don't have all the solutions. And so this is my invite to you to help me in creating these changes. And so here's to creating a better future in public interest tech for everyone together. So I want to specifically thank everyone who completed the survey and to all of the folks at the Beck Center for helping me go through all of the data. And thanks so much for listening. I know I kind of went through the presentation really quickly, but right now I figured we'd open it up to questions and discussion. Just a caveat that I'm definitely not an expert. So I'd love for others to share what they've experienced and learned in their work in this space as well. Folks can either come up to the stand here, you can either raise your hand and I can spotlight you to ask your question, or you can type your question into the chat as well. And I'll go ahead and share the link to the slides in the chat so folks can have access to it. Anyone have any questions? Oh, just to note, if folks are speaking in their little private areas or like little pods, I won't be able to hear you because you're in a private space. So if you are interested in asking a question, please raise your hand and I can, I'll like spotlight you. So raise your hand using the little emoji thing taskbar. All right, I see a question from Alicia. I have you spotlighted. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, and I think everyone should be able to hear you as well.
Okay, awesome. So I was just wondering, so we say this a lot. I work for the New York City Department of Health, and we do internal surveys, and we do ask questions about like, well, we should be asking about retention and we should be asking about, but can you go over like, what would that look like if we were to do like a survey on what retention looks like? Could you go over a little bit like what that might entail?
Yeah, I think with retention, so it depends. If you're doing something on retention within your agency or your department, what I find the most useful is if you actually are able to pull in numbers yourselves rather than asking your employees to do so. So, for example, at this site that we had before, they've had lots of data about it. So this is just people who, on average, how long people stay, right? Or if folks are using the those statistics.
I'm so sorry. The audio was really cutting out. So, like the last 30 seconds, I think, of what you were saying, I couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I was just saying, I'm not sure where I cut off, but basically if you have access to, employment data, you can typically, like working with HR, pull the statistics on just like the employees. So you should get a sense of you can get a sense of, when a person started and when they left, and then get a sense of, okay, on average, for the design team, we have, folks are staying an average of 3 years. And that can be kind of the start of asking about retention. Another thing to ask also on surveys is, how long people intend to stay. I know that that's sometimes taboo, but I always encourage folks to ask about that, especially like for me personally, as I'm, leading and managing teams. For me, I don't necessarily have allegiance to the organization. I mostly have allegiance to the team. And so if I know that someone's unhappy or looking for another opportunity, I try to make that very transparent. And so for me, it's more important to make sure that folks on the team feel included and feel valued. And whether that means that they stay in our organization or they move, is like not really different to me. So asking those type of questions I would encourage as well. And then I think that to answer your question for retention overall, one of the things that we could do if we ask from a third party perspective is ask some of those more specific questions. So, if, for example, if we did another set of surveys, we would probably ask how long have you stayed at your last company? How long did you want to stay? And those type of things. But also happy to open it up to other folks who have done any retention type surveys or interviews and have any best practices they'd like to share. Oh, it looks like Maria has a question as well. Maria, I can spotlight you if you'd like to ask it. Oh, and I see that folks are having a hard time hearing me. Is the audio still kind of mixed up?
No, it's good right now.
Okay, great. And I hope I'm saying your name right, but
you are. That's amazing, Maria.
Yeah, so you're spotlighted and you can feel free to ask your question.
Okay, thanks. So I'm a graduate student, and part of I'm involved in a project where we're trying to get undergrads inspired to get involved in public interest data literacy. And I'm wondering, do you have any ideas on how to get people from college into the workforce? Like, how do we start them excited about it very young?
Do you mean undergrad students to get them interested in public interest tech roles, or yes, even younger than that? Okay.
No, yeah, undergrads. Because a lot of times, once students come to college, they'll say, oh, data, that's math. I don't like math. I'm not going to do anything related to that. And so, but we know that there's a lot more to it. It's not just math. So I'm wondering if you or anybody else has ideas on how to kind of spark that interest.
Yeah, if anyone has any other thoughts, I'm also happy to answer as well. If folks have thoughts, feel free to raise your hand and I can spotlight you. Oh, no, I will spotlight you. Did you want to share, Noel?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, hi, great. Hi, this is Noel Hidalgo from Beta NYC. It's a great question, and New York City has a couple different kind of like initiatives that have been tackling that, and I say the city in very loose terms. One thing is the Department of Education does a thing called Hack League, which is essentially an academic competition throughout the school year that uses open data for them to articulate for middle school and high school students to articulate the problems that they see within open data, and that comes up with kind of like software solutions or projects or initiatives that would essentially address that. What's really cool is that while this is like a multi-semester long academic competition and really tied into the Computer Science for All's values, CUNY has a CUNY Hacks. So they have, I believe it's 2 or 3 hackathons throughout the year where it's a hackathon. They're always looking for the broadest source of participants, and in that, there is a thread around open data, and they include representation from public interest technologists in civil society and government in the hackathon, so that way people can see that you could go work for an ad firm, you could go work for fintech, you could go work for government, or you could work for civil society. And then lastly, there's initiatives like Coding It Forward, and the Code for America Brigades, that are national organizations that are focused on kind of engaging the broad spectrum. Coding It Forward is focused more on undergrads and grad students within the public interest tech, and then Code for America Brigades is kind of a broader group of just becoming aware of what's going on inside of your communities and figuring out how to use technology. And organizations like Beta NYC, we actually have like an in-depth program where we train students on how to become civic data analysts, and we kind of work through a couple of different methods to engage CUNY students all around getting their passions to make their neighborhoods better, and teaching them about public interest tech. And that ends up becoming an apprenticeship program. But there's a lot of different tactics, and I will drop my email address in the chat if anybody wants to follow up on programs for college students. That's something that Beta NYC loves engaging in, because they are, I'm 43 now, and I realize that like these are the people that I would want to be hiring when I'm working in city government to do amazing work. And so we always got to figure out that pipeline, but it's one of our focuses. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Noel. Alicia, did you also want to make a comment? I see your hand is raised. I just spotlighted you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I actually just took another webinar today for the Open Data Week. They specified K through 12, and the webinar was K through 12 data science as a foundation for equity. And some really great points that they brought up was that instead of having like data science as a far off elective that like students can take, making it sort of more mainstream and accessible for all students to engage with. By just doing things like, instead of making data science like a part of computer science, having it more upfront as sort of maybe having computer science as a part of data science, right? Choosing data sets that are inclusive, equitable, that are interesting to young people. Those were some of the methods that they brought up today that I thought was interesting and a little relevant.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. The one thing I wanted to add to both Alicia and Noel, your questions or your answers was just that like I also do this with stakeholders when folks are just like, I'm not tech focused, or like I'm not I don't understand this stuff, I'm not an engineer, or like I don't get math, and I try to really focus on the outcomes, right? So usually I try to ask them a question of like, what's something that you wish you could change in your community? And then kind of like slowly walk them through how, they can tackle that problem without even talking about tech or data or design or like any of these kind of like more foreign things. Especially like I say I use this with stakeholders because do work with a lot of stakeholders that don't, necessarily have the same tech chops. And, as technologists, it's like our job to really demystify that and be approachable. And so for me, I'm just focusing on those outcomes and focusing on, hey, we want to, do this. We're not going to talk about how we're going to do it, but we're going to focus on like what you're going to get if, what the end goal is going to be. Noel, you still had your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question, or did you have any other comments? Oh, okay. Anyone else have any questions or comments, or any discussion? We're also happy to just like give everyone space and to chat with one another in these little breakout spaces, or also happy to give folks 20 minutes back. Oh, Brandon has a question. Let's see. Brandon, I think I have to spotlight you. I'm going to find your name, though. All right, Brandon, go ahead. You're spotlighted.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for your presentation. One of the things that you mentioned about collecting data and then publicizing it was pretty interesting. I've been a part of several organizations where we've tried to address equity and climate issues. And even after collecting the data, there's been quite a bit of resistance, no surprise. I was wondering if you had any other kind of interventions that have been successful other than kind of publicizing. That's one that hasn't really, I haven't thought extensively about, but are there other interventions that are effective both kind of like in a public setting as well as more targeted towards like teams or the organization more broadly?
Yeah, so for me, this data collection and this survey process is really, really similar to what I do in my background as a user researcher. And, as I was putting this presentation together, I was like, oh, wow, I'm constantly in my workspace trying to make the case for design and why we need to talk to users, right? And now I'm trying to make the case that D&I is important, even though we all know it's important. We just aren't able to take the next step to take that action, unfortunately. And so, this is kind of like our first foray into that, chipping away at this big problem at the Beck Center. And we have a handful of other solutions we're going to be working on the rest of this year. But to specifically answer your question, Brandon, the way I relate both of those things is that, I'm constantly talking about the stories, right? So when I'm doing things like user research and I'm, interviewing, maybe I've done a usability test to see, hey, this government website is not working for the hundreds of people that are using it. This is why. Or, we're trying to get some background as to how someone finds out about a food benefit that's available to them. It's easy for me to just kind of collect this data and then hand it off to maybe a product team or like a program team. But what I try to do is actually bring a lot of people together and talk about the data, and kind of similar to this presentation today. For me as a user researcher, when I'm doing that type of work, I actually do it every single week when I'm working on a product team. And so I have an open standing meeting, and it kind of is for me, my practice of just, sharing these stories. So it's a lot of specific user stories that I glean from having those interviews. And so, I find that a lot of the DE&I stuff is the same, especially with the survey. We are still in the process of publicizing the final findings report. And so this was kind of like a sneak peek of it. But my intention is to continue doing these, right? To continue talking about it, to continue talking about why this matters. And I think that that for me has been my way of really creating change and starting to have those conversations. And then I would say as well, with leadership, right? Like if, feel free to take the data that we have and say, hey, this is, these are some of the findings the survey came out with. What does that mean for our organization, right? Or like, taking a look and seeing if other people have stories that are relevant to the findings we have, right? Like, have people felt like, they're the ones that are constantly cleaning up after their coworkers. And they also happen to be perhaps like a person of color and a woman, right? Like, collating all of that and being like, hey, this is really in line with what these survey findings found. One of the things the survey recommends is to equally distribute that. And so I'm hoping that, one, that answers your question, but two, that you can, like, that folks can take this and point to it, make it your own, add your own story to it, and kind of start to have those conversations within your organizations. Awesome. Anyone else have anything? Cool. If not, folks can either still hang out and like mix and mingle, or you can feel free to head out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And feel free to email me or reach out if you have any questions.